The flickering shadow of a kerosene lamp cast long fingers across the weathered floorboards of the small cabin as Lillian Armstrong sat hunched over at the rough-hewn table, tears streaming silently down her face, the letter clutched in her trembling hands telling her what she'd feared for months. Her husband of 3 years had perished in a mining accident near Silver Creek. The night outside seemed to echo her grief, a fierce storm battering the little homestead, rain lashing against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks in the wooden walls of the cabin she and Thomas had built together on the outskirts of Promise, Wyoming territory. At 24, Lillian found herself alone in 1876, a widow with nothing but memories, debts, and an uncertain future stretching before her like the vast, unforgiving prairie beyond her door. She'd run out of oil 3 days ago, forced to use precious candles to see at night, and now even the last candle guttered dangerously in the old brass lamp, threatening to leave her in darkness. The storm had prevented her from making the journey into town for supplies. And now, as the flame dimmed further, Lillian felt it a fitting metaphor for her life, everything that had once burned bright slowly dying away. A sudden pounding at the door startled her so badly she knocked over the lamp, extinguishing the final flame and plunging the cabin into darkness. "Hello, anyone home?" A deep voice called over the storm's fury. "I saw your light from the trail." Lillian froze, fear coursing through her. Being alone on the frontier was dangerous enough for a woman without opening her door to strangers in the night. "I'm just looking for shelter from this storm, madam," the voice continued. "I promise I mean no harm." Something in the stranger's tone, a certain weariness that matched her own, made Lillian rise shakily to her feet. She fumbled for the shotgun Thomas had taught her to use, keeping it ready as she approached the door. "Who are you?" she called, her voice hoarse from crying. "Name's Kyle Hayes, madam. I'm driving cattle to Cheyenne. Got separated from my outfit in this storm. Been riding for hours looking for shelter." Lillian hesitated, then made her decision. People didn't survive long in Wyoming territory without helping one another when needed. She unbolted the door, shotgun still raised, and pulled it open to reveal a tall figure silhouetted against the stormy night. The man stepped cautiously into the doorway, water streaming from his duster and wide-brimmed hat. When he removed the hat, Lillian saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. "Much obliged, madam," he said, then glanced around the darkened cabin. "Seems I arrived just as your light went out, the lamp," Lillian said, suddenly aware of the darkness surrounding them. "I knocked it over when you knocked," Kyle nodded, setting down his saddlebags. "I've got matches. Mind if I light it again for you?" Lillian nodded, lowering the shotgun slightly but keeping it ready. She watched as the cowboy found the overturned lamp, set it right, and produced a matchbox from his pocket. With practiced ease, he struck a match and relit the lamp, warm light once again filling the cabin. In the renewed glow, his eyes met hers, and he seemed to notice her tear-streaked face for the first time. His expression softened with concern. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked gently. The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, broke something in Lillian. Fresh tears welled in her eyes and the shotgun wavered in her hands. Kyle stepped forward carefully, taking the weapon from her trembling fingers and setting it aside. "My husband," she managed, her voice breaking. "I just learned he's dead." Understanding filled the cowboy's weather-worn face. Without a word, he guided her to sit at the table again, then moved to the stove, adding wood to the dying embers and setting a pot of water to heat. "My ma always said there ain't much that can't be helped at least a little by a hot cup of tea," he said, searching through her meager supplies until he found what he needed. Lillian watched in a daze as this stranger moved about her kitchen, lighting more lamps, bringing warmth and light back to a place that had felt so cold and empty just moments before. When he placed a steaming cup before her and sat down across the table, She found herself telling him everything about Thomas heading to the silver mines to earn money for their struggling farm, about the months of waiting with dwindling supplies and mounting debt, and finally about the letter that had arrived that morning, confirming her worst fears. Kyle listened without interruption, his eyes kind but never pitying. When she finished, he simply nodded. "The frontier takes more than it gives sometimes," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Armstrong," she supplied. "Lillian Armstrong." "Mrs. Armstrong," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "If you don't mind me asking, what will you do now?" Lillian stared into her tea, the question forcing her to confront the reality she'd been avoiding all day. "I don't know," she admitted. "The bank will take the farm soon enough. I have some family back east, but—" She trailed off, the thought of returning in defeat too bitter to voice. Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Mrs. Armstrong, I don't mean to impose, but this storm isn't letting up. Would it be all right if I bedded down in your barn for the night?" "I'll be on my way at first light." "Of course," Lillian said, suddenly remembering her manners, "but there's no need for the barn. My husband built a small room off the kitchen for when we had guests. You're welcome to use it." Kyle thanked her, and after finishing his tea, insisted on bringing in more firewood before retiring. As Lillian lay in her bed that night, listening to the storm rage outside, she found an unexpected comfort in knowing she wasn't completely alone, at least for one night. Morning brought clear skies and a transformed landscape, the world washed clean by the storm. Lillian awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. She dressed quickly, embarrassed that her guest had risen before her. When she entered the kitchen, Kyle was at the stove, frying bacon in her cast-iron skillet. "Hope you don't mind," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Figured you could use a hot breakfast." "That's very kind," Lillian said, surprised by the gesture. "But you don't have to, it's the least I can do for the shelter," he interrupted gently. "Besides, I need to be on my way soon. Got to find my outfit before they reach Cheyenne without me." They ate breakfast together, the conversation easier than Lillian would have expected with a stranger. Kyle told her about his life driving cattle, about growing up on a ranch in Texas, and about his dreams of someday having a place of his own. Lillian found herself listening intently, momentarily forgetting her own troubles. After breakfast, Kyle collected his things and prepared to leave. At the door, he hesitated. "Mrs. Armstrong, I know it's not my place, but I'd like to help if I could. I'm due back this way in about 2 weeks. Would it be all right if I stopped by to check on you?" Lillian should have found the offer presumptuous, but instead she felt a flicker of relief. "That would be kind, Mr. Hayes." Kyle tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out, leaving Lillian standing in the doorway, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of decisions and activity. Lillian knew she couldn't maintain the farm alone, so she began the painful process of selling what she could. The bank manager, Mr. Pearson, a thin man with calculating eyes, made it clear the farm would be foreclosed upon by month's end unless the mortgage was paid. Each night, Lillian sat by the lamp Kyle had relit, tallying figures that never added up to enough. True to his word, Kyle returned exactly 2 weeks later. Lillian was surprised by how her heart lifted at the sight of him riding up the trail, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "Mrs. Armstrong," he greeted, dismounting and removing his hat. "How are you faring?" Over a simple supper, Lillian told him about her plans or lack thereof. Kyle listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated a keen understanding of her situation. "The cattle drive went well," he said when she'd finished. "I've got some money put by. I'd be happy to loan you enough to keep the bank at bay for a spell." Lillian stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Mr. Hayes, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept." "We barely know each other." Kyle's eyes held her steadily. "Sometimes strangers become friends mighty quick out here, Mrs. Armstrong. Consider it an investment. This is good land. With some help, it could turn a profit again." After much discussion, they reached a compromise. Kyle would stay for a week, helping with the most pressing repairs and work around the farm. In return, Lillian would provide meals and lodging. No money would change hands for now, but they would reassess at week's end. That week changed everything. Kyle worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, repairing the leaky barn roof, and even managing to fix the troublesome well pump that had been broken for months. Lillian found herself working alongside him, her spirits lifting with each accomplishment. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking long into the night. Kyle shared stories of his adventures on the trail, while Lillian spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania and her journey west with Thomas. Gradually, the raw pain of her loss began to transform into something more bearable, a sadness tempered with fond memories. By week's end, Lillian realized she didn't want Kyle to leave. The thought startled her, bringing with it a rush of guilt. Thomas had been gone barely a month, and already she was developing feelings for another man. When Kyle broached the subject of his departure, Lillian found herself proposing an alternative. "Stay," she said simply. "Not as a guest, as a partner. This farm is too much for one person, but together we might make it work." Kyle studied her face carefully. "Are you sure that's what you want, Lillian? People will talk." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter inside her. "Let them," she replied with newfound determination. "I need help, you want land. It's a practical arrangement." And so it began. Kyle moved into the guest room, and they established a routine of shared work and separate lives under one roof. They agreed to split any profits once the farm began producing again, with Kyle's labor counting toward eventual part ownership if they succeeded. The arrangement raised eyebrows in promise, of course. When Lillian rode into town for supplies, she could feel the disapproving stares and hear the whispered comments. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Thornton, even approached her directly after church one Sunday. "My dear, I understand your situation is difficult, but to have an unmarried man living on your property. It simply isn't proper," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "Mr. Hayes is my business partner," Lillian replied coolly. "And what would be truly improper would be allowing my late husband's dream to die when there's a chance to save it." Despite the gossip, Lillian found herself caring less and less what others thought. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was sleeping through the night, waking with purpose each morning. The farm was coming back to life under their combined efforts. Kyle proved to be not just a hard worker, but a skilled one. He had a natural understanding of the land and livestock that Thomas, for all his determination, had lacked. Under Kyle's guidance, they replanted the fields with crops better suited to the Wyoming soil, repaired irrigation ditches to make better use of the stream that crossed the property, and acquired a small herd of hardy cattle that could weather the harsh winters. Autumn came, bringing with it a modest harvest, not enough to pay off the bank entirely, but sufficient to negotiate an extension with the surprisingly impressed Mr. Pearson. The night after securing the new terms, Lillian and Kyle celebrated with a special dinner. "To partnerships," Kyle said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," Lillian responded, meeting his eyes across the table. Something shifted between them that night. As they sat before the fire afterward, their conversation flowed into deeper waters. Kyle spoke of his father's death when he was just 16, of taking responsibility for his mother and sisters until they remarried or married, of the loneliness of the trail and his longing for a place to call home. "I've been wandering for so long," he confessed. "I sometimes wonder if I've forgotten how to stay still." "And now," Lillian asked softly, "are you restless here?" Kyle's eyes met hers, their expression making her heart race. "No," he said simply. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The winter of 1876-77 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures dropped so low that the creek froze solid. Confined to the cabin for days at a time, Lillian and Kyle's careful boundaries began to blur. They spent evenings reading aloud to each other from Lillian's small collection of books, playing checkers with a set Kyle carved from scraps of wood, and sharing stories of their lives before they met. One night, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside, Kyle asked about Thomas. "You don't have to talk about him if you don't want to," he added quickly. I want to know about the man you loved." Lillian found, to her surprise, that she wanted to tell Kyle about Thomas, his quick laugh, his tendency to start projects he never finished, his unshakable optimism even when things went wrong. As she spoke, she realized she was smiling through her tears, the memories bringing comfort rather than pain. "He would have liked you," she concluded. "He always said I was too practical for my own good. You're a dreamer too, but you know how to make dreams real. That's a rare thing." Kyle was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me about him," he said finally. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Lillian agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she asked, "Have you ever been in love, Kyle?" His eyes found hers across the room, steady and sincere. "Once," he said. "Years ago, she married another while I was away working. I thought perhaps that part of life wasn't meant for me." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "Until recently." Lillian's heart pounded in her chest. A sudden crash from outside interrupted whatever she might have said. Kyle was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to the door. Minutes later, he returned, half carrying a snow-covered stranger. The man was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold. "Found him collapsed against the barn," Kyle explained as they worked together to remove the man's frozen clothes and wrap him in blankets near the fire. "Must have got caught in the storm." For the next 2 days, they took turns caring for the stranger, who drifted in and out of consciousness with fever. When he finally woke fully, he introduced himself as Daniel Foster, a surveyor working for the railroad who had become disoriented in the blizzard. As Daniel recovered, Lillian noticed how his eyes followed her around the room, how he directed his conversation primarily to her even when Kyle was present. It created an uncomfortable tension in the cabin that had become her sanctuary. The night before Daniel was well enough to leave, he cornered Lillian in the kitchen while Kyle was out checking on the livestock. "You know, Mrs. Armstrong, a beautiful woman like you shouldn't be living out here with a man who isn't her husband," he said, standing too close. "It isn't proper." "People in town are talking." Lillian stepped back, her spine stiffening. "Mr. Foster, my arrangements are none of your concern." "I'm only thinking of your reputation," he persisted, reaching for her hand. "I'll be staying in Promise while I complete my work. I could call on you properly, court you as a lady deserves." Lillian withdrew her hand firmly. "Mr. Foster, I'm not interested in being courted. Mr. Hayes and I have a business arrangement that works well for both of us." Daniel's expression hardened. "Is that what you call it?" "Folks in town have other names for women who live with men outside of marriage." "That's enough." Kyle's voice came from the doorway, low and dangerous. He had entered silently, snow still melting on his coat. "Mrs. Armstrong has shown you nothing but kindness, taking you in, nursing you back to health. You repay her by insulting her in her own home." Daniel turned, his face flushing. "I meant no offense. I was merely concerned for the ladies standing in the community." "Your concern is noted and unnecessary," Kyle replied coldly. "I think it's time you moved on, Mr. Foster. The storm's passed, and the road to town should be clear enough by morning." The tension was palpable as Daniel retreated to the guest room where he'd been recovering. After he'd gone, Lillian slumped against the kitchen counter, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry," Kyle said quietly. "I shouldn't have interfered. You can handle yourself." "No," Lillian said, looking up at him. "I'm glad you came when you did, and everything he said about the town gossip. He's right. I've been pretending it doesn't matter, but maybe I've been selfish, not thinking about how this affects you." Kyle crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could feel the cold still radiating from his coat. "Lillian, do you think I care what anyone in Promise thinks of me?" "You should," she insisted. You're building a life here. Your reputation, the only opinion that matters to me is yours, he interrupted gently. Do you want me to leave? Because if you do, I will. But if you're only thinking of what others might say. No, Lillian whispered, her heart in her throat. I don't want you to leave, I want. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Kyle's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch feather-light as if she might shatter beneath his fingers. What do you want, Lillian? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Instead of answering with words, Lillian closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a declaration. But when Kyle's arms encircled her, drawing her against him, it transformed into something deeper, an answer, a promise, a beginning. When they parted, both breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the night I found you crying by that lamp, he confessed. I've wanted you to, she admitted, but I felt so guilty. Thomas would want you to be happy, Kyle said gently. From everything you've told me about him, he loved you enough to want that for you, even if it meant finding happiness with someone else. Tears filled Lillian's eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. I think you're right, she whispered. Daniel left at first light the next morning, his manner stiff and formal. Lillian worried about what he might say in town, but found she cared less than she expected. Something fundamental had changed. The careful distance she and Kyle had maintained dissolved, replaced by a new awareness, tender touches and shared smiles. Yet they moved slowly, both conscious of the weight of the past and the fragility of their new understanding. Kyle moved his things from the guest room to the barn loft. A gesture Lillian understood was meant to protect her reputation while they figured out what came next. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting to reveal new growth beneath. The farm began to flourish under their combined efforts, fields greening, cattle calving, the orchard Thomas had planted beginning to blossom. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kyle took Lillian's hand. I've been thinking, he began, a rare nervousness in his voice, about what Foster said, about propriety and such. Lillian tensed slightly. I thought we agreed not to let gossip dictate our choices. We did, Kyle assured her, squeezing her hand. That's not. What I'm trying to say is. He took a deep breath, then slid from the porch swing to one knee before her. Lillian Armstrong, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first night when I lit your lamp and saw you in its glow, brave despite your tears. I know it hasn't been that long since Thomas, and if you need more time, I understand. But I want to build a life with you, not as business partners, but as husband and wife. Will you marry me? Lillian's heart soared even as tears filled her eyes. Are you sure? This farm, it's still struggling. I can't promise. I'm not asking for promises about the farm, Kyle interrupted gently. I'm asking for a promise about us. Everything else we'll figure out together, the way we have been. Lillian cupped his face in her hands, seeing in his eyes everything she'd come to love about him, his strength, his kindness, his unwavering support. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, Kyle Hayes. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the Promise Church, with only a few neighbors and the preacher as witnesses. The town's attitude had softened somewhat toward them after seeing Kyle's dedicated work on the farm and Lillian's renewed participation in community events. Mrs. Thornton even brought a pie to the small reception afterward, her previous disapproval apparently forgotten. That night, as they stood in the doorway of what was now their home together, Kyle swept Lillian into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I've been home since the night you lit my lamp, she replied, kissing him softly. You brought light back to my life when I thought it was gone forever. The years that followed weren't without challenges. The farm faced droughts and early frosts, market fluctuations and equipment failures. But through it all, Kyle and Lillian faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each test. By 1880, The Armstrong Hayes Farm, as they called it in honor of both their legacies, had become one of the most successful in the county. They had expanded the original homestead, adding a new wing to the cabin to accommodate their growing family, first a daughter, Emma, born in the spring of 1878, and then twins, Thomas and Catherine, who arrived on a snowy night in 1880. The lamp that Kyle had relit on that stormy night 4 years earlier still held a place of honor on their mantel, a reminder of how their love began. Each evening, no matter how busy their day had been, they made time to sit together in its warm glow, sometimes talking, sometimes simply holding each other in comfortable silence. On their 4th wedding anniversary, Kyle presented Lillian with a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this for?" she asked, running her fingers over the cover. "I thought you might want to write down our story," he explained. "For the children when they're older, so they know how something as simple as lighting a lamp can change everything." Lillian smiled, leaning against her husband's shoulder as she opened the blank pages. "Once upon a time," she murmured, "a widow sat crying beside a lamp and a cowboy lit it, and their love began." "That's a good start," Kyle said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But the best part is, our story's still being written." "And it always will be," Lillian agreed, turning to meet his lips with hers, as grateful for this man and their life together as she had been on that first night when he brought light back to her darkness and hope back to her heart. Outside their window, the Wyoming sunset painted the prairie in gold, a fitting backdrop to a love that had grown from the smallest spark into a flame strong enough to illuminate all the years that stretched before them, years they would face together, hand in hand, their lamp always burning bright.